Fantasy literature spent its formative decades treating half its population as set dressing. As the premier architect of the modern tradition, J.R.R. Tolkien laid a foundation where women are largely absent from the narrative. Drawing heavily from Arthurian romance, this baseline established a genre where female characters exist at the center of conflict, but only as passive objects. They are prizes to be won, damsels to be saved, or political tools exchanged between men. Even no rare female characters allowed to take up arms eventually surrender that agency. In The Lord of the Rings, Éowyn fights bravely in war, but ultimately relinquishes her sword, declaring she will be a shield maiden no longer in order to marry and heal. During the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, authors who grew up reading Tolkien began writing their own novels. Writers like Tamora Pierce and Robin McKinley adopted the high-octane adventure of classic fantasy, but actively subverted the prescribed gender roles of their predecessors. But these authors immediately recognized a structural problem. Simply handing a female character a sword or granting her magical abilities does not automatically give her feminist agency. True literary empowerment requires a strict redefinition of power itself. Rather than the patriarchal standard of power over, the domination of others, agency is defined by power to positive autonomy, self-expression, and total control over one's own decisions. To track how successfully characters achieve this autonomy, we map their progression across a specific visual matrix. The vertical axis measures the scope of action, ranging from individual action at the top to collective action at the bottom. The horizontal axis maps the methods of empowerment, placing traditionally male characteristics on the left and androgynous or unified traits on the right. Fantasy authors deliberately engineer their protagonists to navigate this exact grid. They test different combinations of traits and scopes to find the most stable, authentic form of female agency. A character cannot simply be placed on this map. Their agency is only validated through true perceivable effort, the narrative requirement to explicitly show a character's labor, mistakes, and learning process on the page. Plotting characters on these axes reveals how authors structurally balance gender traits while forcing their heroes to explicitly prove their labor to the reader. The first generation of young adult female heroes, characters like Alana and Aaron, secure their agency by adopting traditionally male methods. They fight with swords, endure rigorous physical training, and conquer physical space. This places both characters squarely in the top left quadrant of our matrix. Individual action achieved through traditionally male characteristics. They successfully force their way into a highly patriarchal system. This specific quadrant contains a structural flaw. To succeed within male-dominated institutions, these characters actively suppress their inherent female characteristics. The result risks producing a hero in drag, a character who only achieves power by rejecting her own femininity. Despite this limitation, their methods are highly effective because they are visible. When Erin seeks to invent a fireproofing potion, she does not receive it miraculously. She engages in a rigorous trial-and-error scientific process. The author meticulously details Erin burning her own fingers, adjusting her mixtures with twigs, and taking careful notes over 2 full years. This explicit depiction of labor is the essence of perceivable effort. By showing the character's mistakes and exhaustion, the narrative makes it impossible to dismiss her success as a fluke. Historically, traditionally female skills like intuition, communication, or caregiving have been written as effortless and consequently devalued. Erin appropriates the highly visible, male-coded scientific method to demand validation from the reader. Male-coded methods provide a necessary initial baseline for a character to prove their agency. But by forcing the hero to reject her femininity, this quadrant limits her full self-actualization. This limitation is compounded by a defining feature of the fantasy genre. Giving a female character overwhelming magical power creates a paradox. It actively disempowers her. Look at Alana's magical triumphs. She is portrayed as a passive vessel, surrounded by disembodied nouns like an alien place enclosing her. Compare that to physical combat, where the prose returns to sharp, active verbs. She slammed a fist, controlling her own actions. Erin suffers a similar loss of agency during her late-stage magical awakening. Her previously visible scientific method is entirely replaced by innate, supernatural abilities that require no explained mechanism. This reliance on innate magic directly erodes her carefully established perceivable effort. We see the result, but we no longer see the work. Because the labor is hidden, other characters begin to attribute the heroine's success to destiny, fate, or the gods, rather than to her own earned practical skills. The authors intentionally write this tension into the text. Both characters display acute psychological discomfort, feeling estranged from their own magical successes, and actively trying to change the subject when praised for them. Stripping a character of mundane limitations through magic paradoxically strips them of their feminist agency. It removes their bodily autonomy and hides the labor necessary to validate their power. Recognizing these structural flaws, authors engage in a process called revisioning. They create successor characters to deliberately correct the mistakes of their first-generation heroes. Pierce achieves this through Alana's successor, Kel. Kel's trajectory pulls away from Alana's isolated, magic-dependent existence. She lands in the bottom right quadrant of the matrix, rooted in collective action and androgynous traits. Kel achieves this androgyny not by erasing gender entirely, but by synthesizing it. She combines traditionally female traits, like maternal intuition and empathy, with strict chivalric combat and logical reasoning. The physical metaphor for this synthesis is the shukusen, a Japanese folding fan. It operates as an object of grace, but conceals martial steel. Rather than remaining an isolated legend, Kel institutionalizes her power. She deliberately shifts her impact from individual to collective by mentoring other marginalized women in self-defense. Kel's political evolution pushes this further. She actively petitions the monarchy for systemic legislative change, embedding her empowerment into the law itself to protect female servants. Moving from individual male traits to collective androgynous action builds a resilient, systemic model of empowerment. It creates a framework that survives long after a single anomalous hero is gone. McKinley attempts a similar collective transition with Harry, Erin's distant successor. But Harry stumbles on the strict mechanics of agency. On paper, Harry's successes place her firmly in the collective action quadrant. She leads armies, unifies disparate cultures, and secures sweeping victories. But Harry's narrative contains a critical flaw. She acquires elite combat skills in an impossibly short time frame, driven almost entirely by an unexplained supernatural anger. This complete lack of logical explanation violates the requirement of perceivable effort. The audience never witnesses the grueling trial-and-error labor required to master these abilities. Erin appears to Harry in visions, attempting to act as a mystical mentor, but she fails. Erin cannot effectively teach Harry because neither woman understands the true source of their magical power. Because Harry cannot verbally articulate how she acquired her skills, she feels deeply disassociated and alienated from her own victories. Her power feels like an invasion rather than an achievement. The stark reality of this model is absolute. If a character cannot verbally or logically explain their power, they cannot truly own it. Despite her sweeping collective victories, Harry's agency is severely compromised by her lack of conscious control. Looking at the final matrix, we see two divergent trajectories. Pierce draws a successful line from Alana's isolated masculinity to Kel's collective androgyny, while McKinley leaves an unresolved line from Erin to Harry. Structurally sound empowerment rigorously avoids the extremes of solitary domination and inexplicable magic. This reveals a fundamental friction at the heart of these texts. The fantasy genre intrinsically requires the supernatural to function, but true feminist agency intrinsically requires absolute, uncompromising autonomy. To resolve this friction, authors must force their female characters to painstakingly earn their victories on the page, deliberately stripping magic of its convenience. These authors wrote alongside feminist movements that relied on documented, incremental progress. The slow labor required to draft the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls established a precedent that empowerment is a result of visible effort, not a sudden gift. The third and fourth waves of feminism continue to demand this expansion of definitions, moving away from solitary victimhood and pushing aggressively towards systemic accountability. Power 2 is the only sustainable model for the lady hero. It ensures she writes her own destiny through applied effort, rather than acting as a passive vessel for fate. In this way, young adult fantasy provides an iterative laboratory for teaching pragmatic models of self-actualization. It treats empowerment not as a sudden magical gift, but as a series of earned, articulated decisions.